Sit here for a little while, pull up a chair, and listen to me. I will take you on a time travel journey, very different from the ones we see in movies. We have a habit of imagining the time of Jesus as a place of clean streets, little white marble palaces, people walking unhurriedly in fine and clean linen clothes. But real life, for such simple and hardworking people of that time, was very far from that luxury. If you truly want to understand how things worked, you need to get your feet dirty with dust, endure smoke in your eye, and smell a strong scent in the air. Our destination is Capernaum, the famous village on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. If you had a time machine and descended into the middle of Capernaum in the first century, the first shock wouldn't be with the water of the lake. The shock would be visual. The entire city was black. There were no white painted houses. There was no red brick. The houses, the backyard walls, the paved ground on the main streets, everything was built with a very dark and rustic stone. To understand the reason why the people lived in such a place, we need to look at the ground and go back millions of years in the past. Long before the first fisherman threw his net into the water, the mountain region near the Lake of Galilee was full of volcanoes. The earth opened up and spat fire. Rivers of melted lava flowed down the hill. When this lava, which was hot as hell, hit the water of the Sea of Galilee, it suffered a violent thermal shock. The lava cooled and dried all at once. In this thermal shock, the rock called basalt was born. Basalt is a different stone. As the gas from the volcano tried to escape at the moment the rock was cooling, it became full of small holes, as if it were a thick sponge. And its natural color is black. It is a heavy stone, too hard, stubborn, that ruins any tool. When the first peasant families arrived to found the village, they needed material to build the houses. Poor people don't have the money to send carts to fetch soft, white stones in the south of the country. They looked at the ground and saw that sea of basalt stones. It was free, and there was plenty of it. So, out of pure lack of option and the need to survive, they began to pick up these black stones to build their lives. Building a house there required a lot of arm strength. As their iron tools were weak, they couldn't cut the black rock to make square and straight blocks like today's bricks. They just picked up the raw stones from the ground in the crooked way that nature left them. The owner of the house would take a round stone, another pointed one, another flat one, and stack them up. The problem is that, since the stones didn't fit together right, the wall was full of holes and cracks from top to bottom. The cold wind from the lake would pass through there and freeze the family at night. Since they didn't have strong cement, the only way was to improvise. The South Asian women and children would go to the shores of the lake, gather a lot of mud, mix it with dry straw, pieces of leaves, and even animal dung to give it a better bind. They would take this soft mass with their hands and start pounding it into the holes that were left between the stones. The mud would dry in the sun and block the wind. Civil construction calls this dry stone, because the wall only stays standing by the weight that one stone put on top of another, without a mortar that truly glues them. This brought an enormous danger. If you lived there and decided to take stones out of the wall to open a window and look at the street view, the stones above would lose their support. The entire wall would collapse on your head, crushing whoever was inside. Because of this, the black houses of Capernaum were closed. Boxes. No one made windows. The only entry for air and light was the front door. And even the door was a problem. They built the door very low and very narrow. An adult man had to bend his body, lower his head, and shrink his shoulder to pass through. They did this for two very practical reasons. First, it held the heat of the fire inside during winter nights. Second, it was their security system. At that time, thieves were always breaking into houses at night. If the door was low, the thief was forced to crouch down and enter very slowly. This gave the owner of the house time to wake up, grab a piece of wood in the corner, and strike the invader's head before he could stand up. And there's the room. Now, imagine yourself entering this room in the middle of the day. Outside, the Middle Eastern sun is frying the stones of the street. Sweat drips on the forehead. When you pass through the narrow door, the room swallows you in an almost total pitch black. The dark is scare. Volcanic stone has the characteristic of sucking up light. It does not brighten the environment. The floor was not cold tile. It was pure packed dirt. If the lady of the house dropped a small silver coin on that dirt floor during the afternoon, she wouldn't see anything. The family was forced to spend valuable olive oil. The oil served as fuel. They would put oil in a small red clay lamp, light the string wick, and go look for the coin in the dark. But oil was expensive, so no one kept the light on for nothing. The family's destiny was to live with the dark room even by day. The smell inside was not pleasant either. Since the house was closed, it smelled of moisture. It smelled of stored sheep's wool, of garlic on the wall, and, mainly, it smelled of trapped smoke. As they lit small braziers inside during the winter, the smoke rose and hit the wooden ceiling. Over time, the stones inside the house would get a disgusting crust of soot, even blacker. To try to improve it, some women would wipe a thin white mud on the wall to lighten it. But the smoke from the stove dirtied everything again in a few weeks. The roof of this house of black stones was a story of rustic engineering. Wood was a very difficult thing to get. No one burned good firewood. No one used wood for decoration. The long, straight timbers were used to make the fishing boats, which were the village's livelihood. To cover the house, the man cut with short trunks from a common tree in the region, the sycamore. Since the trunks were no more than 3 meters long, the house couldn't have a wide hall. He laid the wood across the short walls. On top of these trunks, he crossed thin branches of brush. Then, he would go to the marshes with standing water, cut thick bundles of reeds, braid them, forming heavy mats, and throw them over the wooden frame. To seal the ceiling, the whole family went up there. They brought through buckets and more buckets of a very thick mud, mixed with ashes and chopped straw. They trampled that mud until it formed a slab of solid earth. When the sun hit, the earth baked and turned into a packed dirt roof. In the first summer, where the temperature easily passed 40 degrees on a person's head, this thick mud roof was a blessing. It held back the fire of the sun and prevented the heat from entering the dark room. The thick black stone wall functioned as a thermal box. Inside the room, the climate remained cool. People could escape heat stroke by going in there. However, when night came at the peak of summer, the situation got tough. The houses didn't just have the backup. 6, 8, 10 people slept squeezed on the floor. The breathing of that bunch of people in a place without a window heated the room quickly. No one could stand sleeping inside. The solution was simple. The entire family rolled up their thin straw mats under their arms, went out the door, climbed a small staircase of stacked stones on the outside, and went to sleep on the roof of the house. Up there, with their bodies lying on the dry mud, they conceived the gentle breeze from the lake and slept, looking at the immensity of the sky lined with stars. In the winter, life charged its toll. The cold fronts brought heavy storms to Galilee. The rain fell straight and hard on the dirt roof. At first, the roof held up, but with hours of water falling, the dry mud began to soften again. The water entered through the reed gaps, found its way through the branches, and began to drip inside the room. The leak was not clean water. It was a thick drop of brown water, dirty with mud, that fell on the heads of the people, sleeping, dirtying the blankets and the few clothes they had. The family couldn't cross their arms. Every house in their Capernaum had a basalt stone cylinder, very smooth and very heavy, kept on the roof. It was a roller. As soon as the rain took a break in the morning, the father of the family would climb the stone stairs, take that heavy stone roller, and spend hours pushing the thing back and forth. He kept kneading the wet mud, pressing the cracks to seal the hole and force the water to run off outside. It was back-breaking work, repeated in every heavy rain. Understanding how this roof was made helps to imagine one of the most famous scenes of Jesus. The Bible says he was in a house teaching, and the place got so packed that people crossed the street and blocked the door. A group of 4 friends arrived carrying a totally paralyzed man on a stretcher, needing healing. Since they couldn't pierce the crowd, they didn't give up. The men didn't need strong pickaxes to destroy a building's cement. They knew the village houses. They climbed the stairs on the outside. They knelt facing the mud roof and dug with their own hands. They ripped out the reed stalks, removed the branches, smashed the dry mud, and opened a gaping hole between the sycamore timbers. Imagine the shower of dry earth, dust, and old straw that fell on the heads of the crowd down below in the dark room. They tied ropes, lowered the stretcher through the open hole in the roof to the living room floor, and the man walked again. The rustic fragility of the ancient houses allowed this. No one lived alone there. Life needed to be in a group. They lived in large complexes called insulas. The insula was a block closed by a stone wall with a large dirt courtyard in the middle. Around this courtyard, the families kept building the windowless boxes. When the oldest son grew up and got married, there was no option to finance a lot far away and live alone. Survival demanded people together. The whole family gathered, dragged volcanic stones, and raised a little add-on of a new wall attached to the parents' house. Then it was the other brother, and so it went. Over the years, the insula became a tight labyrinth of little rooms with grimy walls. In the middle courtyard, the ground was packed hard. There was no beautiful flower garden there. It was the place of mess and work. They let loose the goats tied at one end, the somewhat dirty sheep eating scraps of brush in the corner, chickens that scratched without stopping, and skinny Saluki dogs barking at anyone who entered. They kept the animals inside there at night to prevent thefts. Privacy did not exist in any way. The poorly made stone wall didn't hold the sound. If the grandmother in a little room was having kidney pain, moaning in the early hours of the morning, everyone in the insula stayed awake out of pity. If a husband argued with his wife because they ran out of flour, the whole village found out the next day. The women cooked together, complained together, and if the widow didn't have anything to eat, the smell of the neighbor's food invaded her house. The lack of money and the hard life on the black stone forced the population to take care of each other so no one would die of despair. The manual labor in the house began when the sky was still dark, long before the sun brightened the waters of the lake. And the ones who started the grind were the women. The first sound of the city waking up was not the rooster crowing. It was the desperate, ugly, and heavy noise of stone crushing rock. The people's entire food depended on bread. There was no ready paper bag, flour at the market. The woman sat on the dirt of the courtyard with her legs crossed and pulled the mill close to. The mill didn't run on wind, it ran on the strength of her arm. It was made of 2 large, round basalt stones. The bottom stone stood still. The top stone was hollow in the middle, had a hole, and a wooden handle stuck into the side. The mother of the family took a handful of dry barley or rustic wheat grain from a pot, threw it through the hole in the top stone, held the wooden handle firmly, and pulled. She spun the heavy-set stone in a circle. The friction of one rock pressing against the other crushed the seed, and the flour fell pouring down the sides of the stone onto a cloth stretched on the ground. Spinning that ground the grain, but it also ground the woman's muscles. Her shoulders ached nonstop. Her hand joints grew calluses. Her back became crooked. She needed to push that for some 2 or 3 straight hours in the dark of the courtyard to get an amount that would yield bread for the three children for the day. This mill hid a silent poison. As I said, the salt as the top stone scraped with a lot of force and weight on the bottom stone every day. It slowly wore down. It released some almost invisible crumbs from the rock, a very fine black dust mixed into the flour. The woman in the dark, attired, couldn't see this rock sand. She gathered everything in the cloth and went to make the dough. Years and years of eating the baked bread stuffed with that volcano dust 3 times a day destroyed the mouths of the people of Capernaum. Researchers who dig up ancient cemeteries there in Galilee get a scare when they look at the skulls. Femme or woman who passed 30-something years of age had a devastated set of teeth. The molar teeth way in the back of the mouth were worn down to the limit of the gum, completely sanded down and flat. Chewing any piece of dry meat became torture. Chronic toothache, inflamed and bleeding gums at night were normal. No one pulled teeth with anesthesia. The same black stone that killed hunger in the mill charged the price by eating the peasants' teeth in. The chewing of the hours. Once the work on the stones was finished, the lady of the house would go light the oven. As firewood was scarce and kept under lock and key for heavy construction, no one made a fire with fragrant wood to bake the lunch bread. Survival mandated burning garbage, and the preferred fuel for the stove was called dung. During the afternoons, the younger children walked the streets where the pack animals passed. They went picking up, with baskets, the fresh fesses of camels, donkeys, and loose goats. They took the fesses to the backyard. The women took the dirty dung and mixed it with water and rustic grass, kneading it with their thick hands. Then they flattened it and made some round discs, looking like flat brown pancakes. They stuck this by pasting it on the soot outside of the house's stone wall in the scorching sun by day. The dough stank a lot at first, but after the sun fried that disc for days on end, the crap dried hard like a light brick, without a wet smell, and became an excellent burning coal. In the early dawn, the woman took the hard dung discs and threw them inside the tabun. The tabun was a small, cylindrical oven made of clay, which sat in the corner of the dirt courtyard. When she set the spark, the straw in the dung caught fire very easily and generated an infernal and strong heat. The price paid wasn't money, it is pain in the eye. The burning of the manure released a dense, thick, heavy, stinging, and sour smoke that invaded the small, closed courtyard without a window and asphyxiated the breath. People lived coughing. Soot. The acid of the smoke hit the eyeball hard. The mothers and the older daughters lived almost all the time with red, irritated, itchy eyes, with chronic eye inflammations that made many people slowly lose their vision as old age approached. But she needed to eat. She kneaded the flour with clean water, put in a bit of sourdough from the previous day that took the place of modern yeast, and stretched the dough. With a quick slap, she pasted the dampened dough on the inside of a scalding clay oven. In less than a few minutes, on the ember of the dun stinging the ties, the bread swelled up full of crusty bubbles, toasted on the edges. She quickly ripped it from the wall. A smell of strong, baked bread invaded the narrow streets and killed the dirty sweat smell of the place. It was the women's prize in the morning. Up old, thin lentil broth from the poor family's pot, while the dung smoke stung the lady's eye in the grimy black courtyards. The bearded men were fighting the war of nerves under the freezing dawn in the deep waters. The Sea of Galilee, the great Kinneret, is not a gentle place. Capernaum was the port of a brutal, sweaty, and silent industry to fisherman extraction. The fishing there didn't have the romance of the little pole with a hook patiently waiting for the cork to sink in the sunny afternoon to take a picture. It was the most exhausting and dangerous job of life. Men like Simon, Peter, and John didn't grab the boat and the tools after lunch and go to the sea. The heavy shift started in absolute dark. The fishermen didn't work in the glare of midday, and the explanation is very easy to understand. First, the blue waters of Galilee were very transparent and clean during the high sun. The nets of the first century were not the invisible nylon threads of the market today. Their nets were rustic, made of thick organic threads of draggled and dark linen from crushed plants. When they threw that into the shallow sea, bathed by the blinding sun, the scuba fish saw the dark danger descending slowly from kilometers away. They would give a tailspin, fleeing in a stampede out the door, and the net came up with holes and empty of wind. The second point was the cracking heat. The sun of the Valley Depression heated the shallow top water of the lake like a pot in the afternoon oven. The thousands and immense schools of rough tilapia or the famous bush sardine couldn't stand the oiling of the blind surface. They dove heavily, diving to the deepest part, down into the pit and the dark of the cold ice that was pleasant, to the side where the fisherman's arm with the net roll never reached. So they needed the dense, stifling, starless, and dangerous darkness of the black night. The fishermen pushed, dragging on the sand, the heavy and hard canoes made of thick, hard wood, assembled without nails, because the metal gave way to the rainwater at the time, using a lot of grimy pitch, sealing the hull grooves so they wouldn't drink the water of the tunnel abyss. They rowed, gnashing their teeth in the black water. The main net that the man there mastered was the dragnet. They threw into the water a very heavy wall of fishing cloth tied to the cords. The top of the web floated because the fishermen attached stumps and more stumps of cork, tied span by span, a light material from the trunk that the water didn't swallow. On the lower edge, at the base of the trap down below, they sank the ends to make the net sink vertically to the mud of the lake floor in the dark without seeing anything. They would appeal again to the black, hard stone, the basalt curse. They drilled the little shards, chips that looked like thick little lead, weights from the black rocks, opening tied holes in the grimy hemp to plummet the wall and snare the life of the oratorinstian transcripted schools, thrown. After this was thrown, partners in the Sydney Boston semicircle with tightening began, and they kept pulling on the ropes in unison with arms of calloused iron, swallowing up the fish and thrashing from fright into the deck reeking of fresh silt, bleeding scales of despair and blind puddle in the night. There was also the fishing of solitude on the edge of the deepest mud. The brave man without a partner went there, stepping into the murky, still, silent waters up to his shin, or stepping firmly barefoot without slipping, balancing on the tips of his heels on the wooden prow. He carried a thick, bundled net, weighing in a folded shape, mounted in a circle on his muscular shoulder, ripped from the cold sweat, shivering from the dawn wind. His narrowed eyes probed the gleaming silver reflections of the moonlight, hitting the scale of the distracted tilapia that strolled quickly, rising into the shallows in the silt on the sly, and the silence of the night fell. With a brutal strike of the arm and a turn spinning the hips fast all at once, he hurled the straws. The swirling mesh opened a huge and gigantic, beautiful circle and slapped down, plummeting flat and open like a tarp on the wet surface in the dull thud of the black water scattering foam. The perforated little feet of the stretched basalt pulled the edge down like bricks, snaring it in a cone and giving no fugitive space for the baits that contorted their desperate cling for the dark. But the fishing wasn't just about calluses or a badly slept night shivering cold soaked in the yellow and grimy clothes of worn-out wool. The lake was a terrifying scenario to haunt tough, experienced, brave fishermen who delayed wives in the windowless brick house, sweat cold in the night, terror of the sudden, lethal, short storms that kill by drowning in absolute despair. The entire region of the sea formed a kind of cauldron of trapped hot air, because it was in an absurd hole in the world's relief. Way in the northern background of the haunting landscape, far from the water, frighteningly large, colossal mountains rose from the stretched horizon, like the funereal peak of La Capernaum, covered thick with snows in the winter and cracking ice. The crazy temperatures sometimes pulled violent surprises, usually in the tide dawn without sun, quiet, without a little wind shaking a vine in the dark pitch black lake that looked like a fixed plate in the flat, boring, mute and tranquil peace. Air masses from the glacier would gather and plummet down the hills, down slopes in the steep corridors, hitting the canyons, funneling and exploded, running over the wind. An invisible piece of cold, freezing, cutting, terrifying aerial current whistling a howling fury that descended in a swoop, plummeting at 1,000 and hit head-on, slapping like a brick of violent shock into the warm, hot, still, wet, asphyxiating, stifling, heavy atmosphere parked on top of the small water docks of the black-blue lake there. This brutal meteorological meeting and shock on the surface unleashed an overwhelming despair. In just about 2 badly counted ticky minutes, the tranquility of the pit turned into a nightmare of violent funereal death, foaming maddened, apocalyptic from the blind fury in the middle of the sea. It without light and a furious, agitated, thick water of the white foams rising, overwhelming, aimless, exploding water, and making the hull of the Galilean sailor creak with the noise of wood, who didn't use safety vests, floating far away there, not on the little beach edge. Violent, very fierce swells formed, short and very deep, crushing waves, rocking, sinking, rising and falling, snapping out of control with a height falling to more than 3, terrifying. Abyssal meters in the storm with gusts tearing furious clothes and the trembling arms breaking oars of blind despair, with screams of panic from the cold and wind whipping water in the face, soaking everything in the weak wood to avoid flipping the slab there of the neighbor's boat and sinking, diving, swallowing the wet death of soaked wool in the thick, dark algae of the deep Kinneret into oblivion, and the desolate, cold, drowned tomb of the sweaty fishing of the Jews in the terror of tomorrow's widow, who cried it in mourning on the dusty shore of Little Stone, crying, blind, in the courtyard, waiting for husbands, swallowed with rage in the dark dread of the sea of the mourning village. When they didn't die and came beating, exhausted, alive, saved, the sweaty, exhausted boat scraping and snapping on the dirt of the beach with the tip tying into the muddy gravel, the clear sunrise and the relieving day brightening the murky water put an end to the nightmare, and they unloaded the jumping fish. But they wouldn't go lie down to heal the noisy pains of the fatigued shoulders, not on the straw bed in the courtyard. They began the most essential, careful, meticulous, detailed, slow, tiring repair of the precious, cruel, heavy, expensive, tied, fragile, exhausting work tools of the families from that black and smelly Capernaum, fixing the net on the stones. The dark net of raw linen from the plants frayed quickly and cost rivers of money for the rustic tide boats. They didn't leave them thrown wet there, tangled, rustic, fetid, tangling on the corners of sand and silt. If they lay down and fit-slept, leaving the dirty nets wet with slime, the dirty nets of the fetid, bleeding fish tied to them, for they rotted everything there quickly, from the mold, fungus and bacteria tearing with rot, ruining in some too. Funereal days of rotting. If the rotted tide rope breaks, the poor guy goes bankrupt from a fishing trip where the scream broke, letting a bountiful funereal load loose for the fish to escape. They had to stay on the edge, sitting suffering in the scorching sun, frying the sand of the bank, pulling and leaning over, washing on the edge on their knees, hitting, and then spreading them blindly over the pebbles of the hot volcanic rock burning to dry. Everything, and then leaning over the patches, picking out tears, sewing dusty old threads with little bone and this. Stretched bronze needles tightening a patch where the fish's tail cut and broke, and the stone poked holes in the flesh so that in the dark night they could enter safely, blind to the lake, in the thick, sweaty, saved, repaired, fetid nets of exhausting work. At this exact time, when they sat off the unloaded beach, the dirty village began to release the strong, cruel, thick, fetid soul that banked the flour in the houses. The heavy, bitter, nauseating, smelly, blind, disgusting smell of formidable, smelly, black, quiet industrial Capernaum, working the living factory of curing raw, salted, torn fish of the women on the dirty, funereal sand pier of sickly, shiny, red, bloody, scattered, unstacked scales, buzzing funereal and blind through the heavy, disgusting, black, dense, noisy, fast, cursed, noisy, fetid clouds of crazed flies eating the bleeding carcasses thrown from the basin and the large, dirty, grimy, black basalt slabs. They couldn't in any way from poverty wait with folded arms and keep the bountiful fat abundance, gumping out of the baskets of raw, fresh fisherman fish of the day for tomorrow's distant sale in the quiet caravan. On the street so as not to shock, spoiled, blind, fetid, sick, rotten with silt from the murderous, frying funereal, disgusting sun baking, melting, killing, spoiled, hot, lethal, sickly, poisonous, blind, funereal, blind, disgusting, rustic, cursed, blind, funereal, formidable meat of 40 quiet degrees of the squeezed streets of the route, without the cold and frozen blessing of modern chic absent iceboxes to save from rotting bottled up. All the time. Women, exhausted, funereal, smelly old men, tied up brats running with the buckets in the grimy courtyards nearby, and workers with cutting rustic arms scraped, rubbed, tore, eviscerated, tore without pity the rustic, cruel, hurried, and dirty fat, silver and robust, heavy, big ones with whiskers of the funereal catfish, and tilapias with thin, sharp, rustic, rusty knives in red, blind and scaly, dirty hands opening funereal squirts, spreading the scaled backs, deboning and taking out and throwing disgusting, blind, embittered, disgusting, sickly guts jumping from the dirty pile of hot trash. The fillets of the large, spiny, eviscerated rustic fish ended up buried, sunken, submerged, buried without sweaty mercy, buried, drowned, blind, smothered in the deep basin full, overflowing, gushing, buried, blind, drowned of the salted piles of immense stoned stones, noisy, burning, sweaty, white, thick, granulated thick, imported, dragged on the burden backs of sweaty donkeys from the long, crushing, stressful, rustic, embittering quiet. Mountain far from the dust of the sweaty, dusty journey, from the great, lethal, boiling, stifling, forgotten, exhausting, deep, salty puddle of the Dead Sea to the south, ripping salt to a city to eat. The burning thick tide and for disgusting salty salt sucked, tearing, sucking, melting, wilting, ripped, eating, drying, drinking, sucking all the water dripping from the cuts, drying, disappearing, darkening, parching, transforming the fresh tilapia's parching. Brown turning into blind, hardened, thin, breaking hard and rough, darkened from kicking with a funereal foot, parched. Like thin, dark, yellowish bark of old forgotten, hard, dusty, parched wood and old from a torn boot forgotten on the hot ground without stiff folds. They tied, binding, hanging, tied, squeezed on the hard wires of the long, funereal, dry, dirty, pointed stakes to the sun in the courtyard to cure, drying, killing funereal hard forever. The dry fish with salt never spoiled in the distant muds of the traveling tide, dusty highway of life in the blind. Dark, dusty burden of the cart on the mules to eat without pain, for the hard Roman soldier to pay, to buy and feed in the dry, cruel, distant dinners and fares in other alleys, so as not to have rustic hunger on the stones in the hard winter of eating fish. Was there trash left over? Did blind rustic trash remain, stinking of raw death of slime and dripping blood, formidable, disgusting, smelling of blind, rotten ammonia, rotting old rustic gut, scale, blind gill, of the stinky leftovers, staring-eyed heads and stinky fine giblets, thrown without money from the thick torn and tied stinky and noisy slabs with sweaty hot blood, from the rustic rubbed red hands of the smelly, filthy, disgusting, noisy, blind, parched leftovers in the blind, funereal, lifeless silt without a sail. They would turn the disgust tide up, rotting, torn, and sick, fetid from those funereal, blind, dirty heads, into the strong, expensive, and disgusting and cool dirty money of the bitterness of the most popped, chic, loved, extremely expensive, splendid, glorious, coveted, famous, fragrant, tasty, opulent, idolized and expensive, valuable, salty and formidable, expensive, millionaire chic sauce in the world, which was the seasonings in Rome that poured out for chic, with money that bought sweaty from blood in the dark. Stinky blind bush. Every leftover entered, overflowing, piling up, stinking, gushing into the grandiose giant grimy. Browned mud and volcano dark black open dusty basins on the side of the open sweaty village slabs. They threw, tossed, pounded, covered, sealed, salting, lining, clogging, pouring blind with salt and through fetid, abandoning tore. Fetid, blind, hot in the infernal, blind, murderous, parching funereal sun of the funereal and hot, disgusting Galilee, abandoning. Days falling from sun into disgusting, long, spoiled days, hot, endless weeks the flies drank furious blood, eating on top, ruining everything. The putrefied, sour, rotten bacteria broth exploding, melting the mass, spreading. Sinking, undoing, with disgust dissolve the rest, grinding, melting. A terrifying, thick, blind, sour, bubbling, thick. Disgusting, murky, rotten, soupy, murky, disgusting, torn dread. Flowed from the dirty pressing, filtered from the disgusting, fetid black cloths there, fetid smelling, pungent, fetid to the cursed blind gut death salt and ammonia. And as it was pulled, filling clean, blind, long-sealed, rustic, thin, extremely expensive, dark ceramics of thick, cursed, rustic, blind, bottled fame. It was from the dirty sweat of the valuable, formidable cheek garum, the sauce that entered the steak, the chic pork in the herbs of the crushing imperial capital on the opulent pagan Roman plate. Capernaum smelled spoiled, rotten from the gut-eating sun for the empire to drool at the crushing and rich parties. It was from there, from the ugly volcano stones, that they took from the formidable torn fish of the muds the blind, things for the little money of the villages, for the flour of the sweaty mill, spinning the quiet dawn of the cracks. From the fetid dust of the insula, not to kill the fisherman with his tail tied there from misery. And this was the hard-suffered, quiet, fragrant, beaten, oppressed, oppressive, heavy, scary life at their funereal blind black door there. Funereal, quiet, cursed, crushed, and noisy, full and funereal of life, of noisy, dusty pains. The worst oppression, however, walked in uniform. This village was not isolated as we think. The greatest highway of the ancient world, the Via Maris, passed glued to the back of the city, at the door of the houses. Travelers and merchants from all over the world crossed this road every day. Endless dust rose from the carts, and where the wealth and money of the floral from caravans from Egypt to Damascus passed, the governments came to cash in with taxes and fury. The city was exactly at the limit of King Herod's border with the neighbor's land. Right in the middle of the fetid square, pile with commerce from the dusty black basalt villages, sweaty, blind with dust. The official tax collectors of the Empire raised their tent, their scale, the toll customs post. The extortion at the toll was cruel. Levi, known today as Matthew, sat at the table charging exorbitant taxes from everyone, stealing from the funereal donated fish, baskets from the exhausted fishermen of nights at sea. They charged the widow passing by, taxed the traveler, stole, and pocketed the rest, fattening their pockets with the sweat of neighbors from the black stone, eating bran in the mills of the street nearby, in the rustic, cursed black alleyway at the exhausted, beaten mill. It was because of this oppressive, exploiting corruption of blind blood in the humble rustic street of stone that the local publican was crushed, rejected as impure, disgusting, blind, funereal, dirty. Revolt swallowed the theft, because the uniformed military security walked heavily through the black alleyways with their suffocating shields. The imperial troop there did not play on duty. The caligay, the thick boot pierced underneath, lined, stuffed, and pointed with many iron nails in the hard soles of the red leather of the capes, strolled marching on the volcano cobblestones, making the terrifying and deafening and lethal and frightening and suffocating and cruel, dry, scary noise of the metallic clicking clack, 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 clack in the quiet blind. Cursed narrow and black alleyways that haunted life there, silenced, forever blind, oppressed, formidable blind, cursed, funereal, without peace from the tax of the table, stealing blindly in the villages. Life turned, the carpenter came to turn the game, crushing the funereal pains with hope in the humble little room, in the synagogues and on the street, until the stones collapsed with the fury and abysses of the apocalyptic monumental geological earthquake, a torn from 749 AD that buried everything cursed in the sweaty and muddy oblivion of the Telham Hill. The healing, hope was not born in palaces or thrones of white, perfumed, impeccable, sumptuous, fine, glorious linen. It was born, shining, healing, crushing the darkness and consoling crushed, painful, blind people in the humble, cursed funereal. Dirty, sweaty, crushed, and old, formidable basaltic crack of quarries of the exhausted pains of the rustic, grimy quiet. Formidable little town of fishermen under the star, without fear of getting the hem of the soul dirty. Because the brightness of life prefers to light up blindingly on the dark rock. Where the dust hits the eye, the cure cleans the blind tears forever. End of chat, and a good morning to you from the sweet lake waters that reflect the bright sun.